Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in for week 10 of our COVID-19 weekly health check. With us again, we've got Kyle Swain from Lpc Cresa, long-standing leasing and tenancy partners of the National Retail Association. Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Beck. Week 10, we've been going through this. So, as I said last week, I would commit time this week to covering off what I think are the remaining key talking points and the questions being most asked of us at the moment at this stage of the COVID-19 pandemic period. So the next slide, Beck, has the list of those key talking points for the week. I was going to touch on turnover, gross sales, online sales, and when it's relevant to focus on profitability rather than turnover. And for those that have been here sitting in on most of these sessions, or all 10 of them, you'll know that I harp on every week about turnover as the component that we focus on to determine impact of COVID-19. But when is it relevant to focus on profitability of the business rather than turnover? And how do you use that to your advantage in negotiations? Going to have a very quick look at legislation versus the mandatory code of conduct. And again, for 10 weeks, we've been talking about the code of conduct, but we'll just very, very briefly touch on the legislation's role in negotiating based on the code. And just going to touch quickly on how improving your knowledge improves your outcomes and what you really need to do in order to achieve the best outcome. So let's jump into those, Beck, with we've talked for a number of weeks about rent relief being proportional to impact. What exactly is it needing to be proportional to? We've addressed a number of times turnover and how you calculate turnover. The other term for turnover is gross sales. There is a specific definition of gross sales and what it's to include and doesn't include. In the past week, I've certainly gone back to a number of clients and asked them to recalculate their gross sales that they've provided me. Businesses that I understand quite well, obviously, being a tenant representative allows me to understand what they're including in gross sales and what they should exclude. And to give you an example, the definition of gross sales, and these definitions do vary a little bit state by state, but certainly in Queensland, for example, the definition of gross sales allows you to remove any delivery charges for online sales or delivery charges, and that's got particular implications in the last 10 weeks or so for businesses that like food and beverage businesses. And I use an example of one of our clients, Baskin Robbins. Were able to trade but not dine-in options, so they significantly ramped up and focused on home delivery options. The delivery charges on each sale can be deducted from your gross sales. That would be the same if you're a florist or any other business where you're conducting online sales from your premises, which are included as a part of your gross sales, but the delivery charges and any fees associated with that can be deducted from that figure. I had another question this week specifically around that. So just to clarify, where online sales are included in your gross sales is when the online sale is generated from your leased premises. So the stock that you're supplying to the customer is coming out of your stock held at the premises, or it's been collected by the customer at the premises. If you essentially take an online sale, walk out to your shop floor or your selling reserve, pick the item off the shelf, package it up and take it off to the post office and deliver it, that's a part of your sales, gross sales for your retail store. If, however, that online sale is coming through to your distribution centre or warehouse down the road and being packed there and sent from there, or it's being collected from a different location to your retail store, then it does not need to be included in your gross sales. Now, hopefully that's clarified that aspect of it, turnover and gross sales, how to calculate those and what to remove from it. If you need really specific advice for your particular state, feel free to send an inquiry or just jump online and Google the definition of gross sales under the retail tenancy legislation in your state. So when is it relevant to focus on profit rather than turnover? Again, a specific example this week, working with a client who has fallen below the level of assistance, the 30% critical percentage for being having the code applied to that business, at risk, I guess, of the landlord saying, well, you don't comply with the requirements, I don't have to provide you any relief at all. Whereas in this situation, that the sales have not been impacted at the top line, so that the turnover or the gross sales result is only impacted by, say, 8 to 15%. But in order to achieve those sales, the business has taken specific action that has held sort of top-end sales, but certainly impacted the business in terms of profitability. So the net profit result is certainly impacted by 40 to 50%, even though it doesn't look like that at the turnover level or the gross sales level. Essentially, that business has bought those sales through reduced margin, discounting, going to market and finding a new client and offering them exceptionally low pricing in order to bring them on board. Those sorts of actions really should be rewarded and not penalised. So in that case, we would look at presenting more detailed information to the landlord. And that's the discussion where all along we've said all you need to provide is your turnover figures and the relief should be proportional to that. In this situation where the impact on the business can't be measured at gross sales level, but can be measured at a net profit level, we can negotiate in good faith with the landlord on that level. But what it will require is for us to provide more detailed profit and loss sheets and other financial information showing the direct comparison at a net profit level, and probably some other documents to show how or why that the net profit was impacted when the gross sales were comparable to last year or within 10%. So that's when, and the code is, it certainly mentions turnover and the focus is on turnover, but there is certainly a small component in there that does allow you to focus on overall performance or the bottom line rather than the top line. So again, it's a part of the intent overall of the code to be fair and to address impact on the business. So it's possible to do that, but as I said, you would need to be comfortable to provide a whole deeper level of information and data in order to have those negotiations in good faith with the landlord. Let's pop on to the next one, Beck. So I want to address legislation versus mandatory code now. We spoke briefly last week. There was a question asked about the Queensland legislation. I indicated that was due any day. It actually got passed the next day, Thursday afternoon last week. The regulation was passed into legislation. That's now in place, and there's some good and bad stuff in there. Two key points on the Queensland legislation, if you happen to have your business in Queensland. One is that it does provide a time frame for the process once it's initiated, that the agreements need to be in place within 30 days, so it can't drag on and on and on. At the end of the 30-day period, we're able then to take that to the new Small Business Commissioner, who also started in that role last Thursday. So last week I told you that QCAT was the way that we needed to address issues and mediation for any disputes around this. As of Thursday last week, it's now with the Small Business Commissioner, and that's the same across every state now. That's a good thing. The troubling thing from the Queensland legislation is it's not specific on proportional relief. So we're all along we've been pushing for assessing impact on your business and then achieving relief from the landlord, a reduction in rent proportional to that or the same level as that. The Queensland regulation is actually not specific on that. It does probably open the door for your lessor to offer a lower amount of rent relief, but I would argue that that's not in good faith and not in keeping with the principles and the intent of the mandatory code that this regulation gives effect to. So again, understanding the code, understanding it very well, and the intent and the original principles that built that code is critical to achieving the best result and the right result for your business. WA is the only state we're still waiting on to pass that legislation, which is also imminent. Hopefully that also comes through this week, and then we can push on with some retailers unfortunately being held up over there because of that regulation not yet being in place. There is minor differences in every state, and maybe we can address that if it's of interest to people. But for example, as I said, Queensland doesn't measure, isn't specific on the proportionality component. Other states have some slightly differing components in there as well, or emphasis. You need to understand the key differences per state. And then the final one there is to understand that legislation, which elements of the mandatory code are left silent or even have been altered, as I've given a couple of examples of. If we go on to the final one, Beck, I guess this sort of wraps some of this stuff up. I want to encourage you to invest in getting the best outcome. Despite there being a mandatory code of conduct in place, despite that mandatory code being quite prescriptive in what's required of the lessors and the lessees, despite the principles being prescriptive around negotiating in good faith and essentially telling the two parties to sit at the table and work it out. Even us as tenant advisors and tenant representatives are having challenges in bringing these matters to a conclusion and great difficulty in many cases getting compliance from landlords. So what we're seeing through the NRA inquiries and through inquiries directly to us at Lpc Cresa and through our dealings with our clients, what we're seeing is that those who aren't really aware and educated on the content and the principles of the code and being able to speak to their lease terms and conditions, general legislation in their state or territory, and then the specific regulations and legislation around this code are not achieving the results that they should be, and certainly not in a timely fashion like is the intent of the mandatory code. So I wrote there, landlords employ property managers and leasing agents for a reason, and that reason is they want the best deal for them They want lease terms and commercial terms in their favour, and they want the highest rent that they can achieve for their business. In some cases, landlords have a strategy in place around the tenancy schedule and tenancy mix, and the retailers that they want to provide retail services for their particular market demographic or target client. There's a few landlords who do that very well, and I think I've mentioned a couple of examples of that, who essentially provide a curated retail process. But by and large, the landlord does not go into a negotiation with a tenant without representation by a party who is acting in their best interests and has good knowledge of the processes, the legislation, and so on. So what I'm saying to you is you're at a distinct disadvantage if you're not doing the same. And we're seeing that, and we're seeing massive examples of that over the past 8 to 10 weeks regarding that, or from people in that situation. So I want to remind you of a quote that I had up earlier in this series in the first couple of weeks, which says, "You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate." Very famous negotiator, Chester Karras, worked for the Hughes Foundation, and that quote is well used and well referenced, and that's because it's correct. What we encourage you to do is invest in your knowledge or invest in a specialist to negotiate on your behalf. I've got the picture there is what every tenant should know about commercial leasing and post-COVID-19 impacts. At LPC Cresa, we've taken some of our most popular commercial leasing training modules and put it into a webinar series. So expanding on this, which is quite a casual webinar series looking at some frequently asked questions, to actually putting it in a more formal training module content, where 2 modules each week over the next 4 weeks starting tomorrow. If you've got more negotiations coming up around COVID-19, if you've got lease renewal coming up in the next year or two, if you're someone in your company who has to negotiate or deal with landlords on critical lease events, then I would absolutely encourage you to go to our website and click on the training module and have a look at these webinars. And the quote that I'll leave you with there is that if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. We see many, many times over how much people leave on the table by not understanding their rights, their obligations, and the opportunities they have to improve the situation. So with that, I might open it up to actual questions from participants this week. And I would also encourage you, while we're waiting for a few more questions to get typed in, please link to us on LinkedIn, connect with us at either LPC Cresa or the retail specific site, LPC Cresa Retail, where we share regularly insights, updates, information, or items of interest in retail and commercial leasing, specifically focus on the tenant side. Feel free to connect with us. Feel free to send me a message personally on LinkedIn and say hello. I'd certainly like to follow your business if you're a retailer, and be a contact ongoing. How are we off for questions, Beck? I've talked enough.
Sorry about that, Kyle. So we actually do have a few.
You're not off.
No, just press the wrong button. We have a few questions already. Teresa has asked, We have put forward an offer for reduced rent to Vicinity, but have still had no response from them. They have recently announced an intention to capital raise $1.2 billion to shore up their financial position. Do you think this will affect our negotiations? And if so, in what way?
No, I don't. So in no way. I don't think that will affect it. That's business as usual for them. Vicinity have been on a path of capital raising for a while. They had some assets they had on the market. They have plans to invest in their tier one sites, like Maya Centre in Brisbane is one of those. So I hope they raise the funds. I hope they put them into reinvigorating some of their key assets. But I don't think it's got anything at all to do with your experience and the process for negotiating these. I'm not sure which state you're in with Vicinity, but certainly if you're in Queensland, I would reiterate that, resend it to them, and just advise quite specifically that you're initiating the process and your formal request is such and such. And then, from that date, they have 30 days to come to an agreement with you, or you can escalate that to the Small Business Commissioner if you're not at that point. Hopefully that satisfies it. But if you've not heard anything, we would normally only go 3 to 7 days maximum before following up on those sorts of correspondence with a landlord.
And we have a question from Mark. The Victorian legislation to give effect to the code adopts a different definition of turnover to the code. Victoria uses aggregated turnover per various provisions of the ITAA 1997, while the code uses GST turnover, the definition used for JobKeeper. Are you aware of states other than Victoria having a different definition of turnover?
Well, kind of every state has its own definition of turnover in its normal legislation. I can't answer that specifically, Mark, without having a closer look at Victoria's legislation, which is probably the most deviated from the mandatory code of any of the states. So if it's all right, I might get that question off Beck later and come back to you, Mark, by email if I could, because that's probably a little more complicated than what I've got 30 seconds to answer.
Fair enough. So our next question is from Glenn. How long can the landlord take to come back to you with their position on rental relief or any relief?
Now, again, depending on which state you're in, Glenn, and I think you're in Queensland from memory.
Yes, he's just confirmed Queensland.
Isle of Capri. So, as just mentioned, under the Queensland legislation, as long as you identify that you have either party can initiate the process, and from the time that the process is initiated formally, under the regulation in Queensland as of last Thursday, you have 30 days to reach an agreement. So, I know you've already made some contact with them, and you need to clarify your online sales component, Glenn. But once you can provide the information and specifically what you're requesting, and notify them that this is the formal initiation of that process, it needs to come to a halt or to a conclusion in 30 days. I do know the landlords and the centre manager at your centre, and I think that should be achievable. They're fairly reasonable. I think the challenge is just getting the definition of your gross sales right and getting the right information to them so that they can make the decision.
Our next question is from Kelly. Our lease goes up each January with a CPI percentage increase. I'm eligible for JobKeeper and have an application for rent relief with the landlord, but haven't asked for removal of CPI increase. Will CPI increase, and is it reasonable to ask for removal of the increase as our sales turnover figures are not recovering? We are lower than April.
Yeah, look, the essence of the mandatory code of conduct is around the rent and the base rent, and we've indicated that a number of times over the last 10 weeks or so. But as I indicated today, there is an underlying element, an overarching principle, to use the right term under the code, which allows both parties to renegotiate terms of the lease in this case. So if both parties are acting in good faith and are prepared to openly discuss, what it does is when you move from straight turnover to other impacts on your business, they probably have a right to ask for more detailed information, ask for P&Ls, BAS statements, tax returns, and things like that to assess your business outside of just the straight impact on turnover. Now, if you're completely comfortable providing that information, and you don't think that will in any way cause a problem for you down the track negotiating a lease renewal, and they understand all your financials and your profitability and all those sorts of things. Or if you're a single store rather than a group of stores and you don't want them to have visibility of how the other stores are performing or not performing, or your position overall, but just this one store, then take all those things into consideration. To answer the question, can you negotiate other clauses, other commercial terms within the lease? You can. They're not obligated to come to the party on that. You can negotiate them. However, if that annual increase fell within the pandemic period, the mandatory code of conduct covers that and says that it should be not increased during that period. It should push out until after that period. But in saying that, CPI, as we've indicated previously on this webinar, is we expect to be a negative this year. I'm not sure by January next year, but over this financial year, it's expected to be a negative. So you may not experience an increase next January at all anyway. So I probably, on the basis of a CPI increase, I probably wouldn't waste all my gunpowder on negotiating that aspect. I would focus on the base rent and making sure it's waived rather than deferred, which will give you a much better return, much better outcome going forward in January through next year.
Okay, our next question is from Shivji. Hi, my gross sales for April are down by 24% compared to April 2019, and the landlord has refused to provide rent assistance. Their reason is the gross sales should be down by at least 30% as per the code. Is there anything we can do about this?
Yes. Again, it comes down to landlords who are taking the code literally and refusing to provide any rent relief because you're at 24 or 29% and not the required 30%. So this is where you could look at your overall impact on profitability and determine whether overall impact on the business is greater than 30%. Or alternatively, the strong push is back to the intent of the overarching principles of the mandatory code. Look, 30% was an arbitrary number that was put in place. It was never intended to be the cut-off point. It was always the intention for both parties to act in good faith and negotiate. We've certainly negotiated rent relief as low as 10% for clients of ours, with willing landlords who were willing to come to the party, even though they didn't meet that standard or necessarily other standards. They weren't considered an eligible business. but not being an eligible business by definition under the JobKeeper program does not preclude you from negotiating an agreeable outcome between the parties. So if your landlord just flat refuses, then there's no compelling clause in the mandatory code or in the regulations that require them to. But you could certainly go to mediation on that and argue that that the intent was to provide some rent relief to impacted businesses, whether they're eligible or not. And that's certainly been sort of at the front of everything we've communicated over the last 8 and 10 weeks.
And just followed up with as well, how many days to reach an agreement in New South Wales after initiating the process?
It's not defined, unfortunately, in New South Wales. We just have to continue to push on that, and how we're forcing that hand is by applying the code right from the start. So when we identify with our clients the level of impact on the business, then we're paying proportional rent in that amount while we're negotiating. Now, where landlords come back and say you have to pay full rent or we're not negotiating, then we address it as the business is meeting its lease obligations and under the intent of the mandatory code of conduct, under the principles that they're paying all the rent they're able to, given the impact on the business during COVID. So while it's not mandated as to how quickly New South Wales landlords have to respond and come to an agreement, there is terminology in the mandatory code of conduct which talks about timely fashion. That's why it doesn't prescribe supplying all sorts of financial data, rather just accurate information from a point of sale or an accounting software program, because it's about being timely and achieving an outcome. And that needs to be communicated to the landlord who is tardy on this, and understanding why they're taking time to make a decision on it. And remember, it doesn't need to be a single decision that covers the entire 6-month period or the next 12 months. An initial agreement agreed by letter, signed letter, can be reassessed after 3 months. It can be adjusted or added to or continue. So there's lots of reasons why they may be not agreeing to anything right away. We need to overcome those barriers, push on, get an agreement. But you can also pay rent proportional to what you're offering and what you're requesting in the interim, and then have that adjusted when an agreement is reached. So it shouldn't impact on you and the rent that you pay if they're being slow on it.
Thank you, Kyle. So it is after 1:30 now, and that is the end of our questions. Is there anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Yeah, look, just starting to feel for a lot of retailers who are having a lot of difficulty getting these things across the line. I know behind the scenes, the NRA and others are still working feverishly to try to improve that situation for tenants. So please stay tuned. There is a lot happening. Continue to communicate openly with your landlords. Like anything, you need to put an offer on the table and follow up on that if they're not responding. Hopefully the information shared today gives you some direction. I think we have a role to play with you for another 2 weeks at least, and we'll reassess how much value we can add. But if you are finding this beneficial, please let the NRA know. Please send through things that you would like to be covered, and we'll provide this if it's adding value.
Couldn't agree more, Kyle. So the purpose of these webinars is essentially to help retailers. So please communicate with us. Send all your questions to marketing@nra.net.au. So once again, thank you very much for coming along this afternoon, and we will see you same time next week.
Thank you all. Cheers.